Welcome to this episode of the Leading Tomorrow podcast, where we discuss tips and trends that help you connect with the next generation. I'm your host, Jolene Erlacher, and today we're going to talk about why sometimes there appears to be more than a generation gap between those who are older and younger. Have you ever been talking to someone, maybe even a family member, who's older or younger than you, and you struggle just to even understand where they're coming from? Of course, there's things like personality that still play into differences, but today we are seeing completely different values and worldviews across generations that often results in parents or grandparents who raise their kids in a specific environment with specific values, really struggling to understand how those young people are now choosing completely different perspectives and values. It can be really disconcerting when we don't understand the dynamics that are playing into this and affecting this. So I wanted to start this conversation by sharing a little analogy that I often share when I'm presenting on generations. Imagine that you are in a blue room where everything is blue. Everything that people know in that room is blue. The rules are blue, the views are blue, everything is blue. This is the room that the silent generation and the baby boomers were born into. Roughly those 1964 and earlier were born into this room, where everything was blue. That was how the world functioned and ran. Then along came Gen X, born from 1965 to 1980 or so. And Gen X was born into the blue room with a lot of the rules of the past, but they were born next to an open doorway where they could look through and they could see that there was a green room on the other side. And so Gen X, while they understood the values and perspectives that have been, they also had an understanding that there were things that were different. There were other rules and other views. Then came millennials. Millennials were born roughly 1981 to 1995 or so, and millennials were born into the green room. However, they were also born next to the open doorway, and they could look in and see that there was a blue room on the other side of the doorway, where the values and views were different. But the green room was what they knew from the time that they were young. It was the values and perspectives and behaviors that were portrayed on television, through movies, through music. It was the communication style that was being used by their peers. And it was the worldviews that were being taught in the education system and culture. And so suddenly, this is a generation where they are learning things and developing in a world that looks very different from that of their parents and grandparents. The complete foundation of how we view things, how we interact, was shifting dramatically, and there was a whole new set of rules, the green room rules. Well, then along came Gen Z and now Gen Alpha, the youngest generations. So Gen Z was born roughly 1996 to 2010, 2012, and then Gen Alpha is our youngest generation today. These generations were born into a green room. The door had closed. There was no glimpse into the blue room. Everything that they have known in their lives is green. They might hear about the blue room from people who tell them about it. I think about my own kids who understand concepts from the blue room because they watch old TV shows or listen to, audiobooks that talk about these things, or they might hear their parents or grandparents discussing them. But the world that they interact with every single day reflects the green room. It reflects the realities of this new environment that is dramatically different from what we've had in the past. So some of it is kind of funny. It's practical things like phones that actually have cords. Those are very blue room. Those born in the green room have never had to have a phone with a cord. Things like dial-up internet, the millennials understand it. But that is not, it was in that doorway phase. A world without the internet, that is blue room. The green room, that has always had internet. We've always been able to interact and connect. You think about things like Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Anxious Generation, talks about play-based childhood. That was a blue room concept where young people grew up with a play-based life. They would work, they would play, they would do things that were face to face, that were synchronous, where they were interacting with people that were present with them in that moment. So face to face communications and interactions, their communication style was embodied in the blue room, where you were paying attention to facial expressions and tone of voice and body language. That was just natural in the blue room. In the blue room, we believed in things like facts, logic, and reason that were outside of ourselves, that there was truth to be discovered that was objective, separate from ourselves. So a lot of those things were very much a part of the blue room. For those born into the green room, the world has changed. Much of their connection has been virtual to some extent since they were a very young age. It is often asynchronous, which means often they're communicating with people at a different point of time than that in which they're actually living. Their communication is often disembodied, where they are using simply language or maybe even images to communicate. I often think of riding on a shuttle at an airport a little while back when I was traveling for a speaking engagement. And there was a young lady in front of me. She was probably 15 or 16. And she had just gotten off the plane. She was pulled out her phone and was checking her Snapchat and Instagram. And literally, she just took picture after picture after picture. And she was sending picture after picture after picture without any language. It was only images that she was communicating, connecting with her friends through. And so the way we communicate is completely different. And in this new environment, we also have an emphasis on the individual. The green room, the foundation of the green room values and worldviews are the individual, that the individual is almost sacred, that the individual gets to determine what feels right to them, what seems right to them. They get to determine their own truth. One of the most common phrases Gen Zers and Gen Alpha will hear are things like, be true to who you are, or you do you. So there's this emphasis on the person and that you need to determine what your own truth or reality looks like. So it's a completely different way of looking at the world. Now, it doesn't mean that every person who's born into the green room holds these values, but it is what they are confronted with through their peers, through the media, through the culture, and even education in many cases. And so the very foundation of the world has shifted. So when we can grasp the fact that it's not just a generational gap, but is truly a seismic shift in how culture functions that is resulting in many of the differences between those who are older and younger today, it helps us appreciate how we need to adjust our perspective as well as our approach. The green roomers are trying to figure out how to survive in a green room. I often have older leaders say to me, well, why don't young people today want to learn how things used to be done or why we do things the way we do them today? The reality is if we are doing things in a way that feels like a blue room, that is based on blue room processes or values or perspectives, then often it's going to not make sense to a green roomer why we're doing what we're doing. But they often intuitively sense that the green room rules and ways of doing things are not going to function in the green room. So to take time and energy to try to understand the blue room just doesn't seem worth it in many cases because they are struggling to figure out how to function in the green room because there's not a lot for them to go on. The reality is that most of us who come from the blue room had role models, had mentors, had processes that we could look to from previous generations and say, okay, this is what we did. We can adapt this for our time. And it's going to have elements that are going to work in our moment. We could learn because culture had been stable for a period of time. But as culture has shifted these past 20 or 30 years, young people intuitively sense the way we did things 20 years ago or even 10 years ago is not necessarily going to work today. So, how do I figure out what to do today? They're often doing this in a vacuum of leadership or of mentors who can help them navigate the green room. Often they're on their own trying to figure out what does it look like to build meaningful connections and relationships in this culture where so many of my connections are virtual. How do I hold to my convictions when everyone has kind of this philosophy that we each get to choose what's right for us? And to violate that freedom that the culture has given people to decide what is right for them is a significant violation of cultural norms in the green room that often blue roomers don't understand. So the significant change has occurred. And green roomers are trying to figure out, how do I lead? How do I live successfully? How do I build strong relationships? How do I succeed? They are watching many people who are struggling to adapt to the green room and maybe getting canceled on social media, or big companies that are being closed down because they're not adapting quickly enough. They see that if we don't adapt to some of the ways of functioning in a green room, the longevity of that relationship, that company, whatever, might not survive. And so there is this pressure to figure out how to live in this new environment. One of the things that I see is that often blue room generations are hesitant to step into the green room. Most of us have been told that as leaders and mentors, we need to have knowledge, we need to have expertise, we need to have answers to questions. And the reality is, we don't really understand the green room. And Gen Alpha and Gen Z and millennials are much more effective in the green room than older generations. So, as a leader or a mentor, a parent, to step into the green room, can feel like a foreign environment, and we don't bring the expertise that we might like to have. But the reality is that we do bring wisdom. If you are a blue room generation, you have experience, you have perspective that is needed in the green room. However, it's not going to necessarily be applied in the same way that it was in the blue room. So we have an opportunity today for those who are from the older generations to really step across the threshold into the green room and to practice humility, to say, I need to learn about the world that young people are experiencing today. I need to understand better the changes that feel uncomfortable to me. I need to understand how to communicate better in this new context. The reality is for those born in the blue room, will probably never be fluent in green room language or green room processes, but we can come alongside those who are in the green room and support them, encourage them, equip them to thrive and to be successful. And the reality is, if we are leading programs or businesses or organizations or teams, we also need the insights of those in the green room to be able to adjust for the world as it's changing today. For those in the green room, sometimes it can feel like those in the blue room just don't have a clue. They don't understand. They don't see some of the things that were being experienced today by those who are younger. And so it does require from those who are younger patience and the willingness to explain and to understand that this is a whole new world for those who were born earlier than you, and that there's a role for us to collaborate across generations to support, encourage, equip, and learn from each other. We desperately, desperately need that right now. So, regardless of your age, I just encourage you to take some time to engage with those who were born into a room different than your own, who were born into an era that had different perspectives and values and worldviews. When I present on intergenerational relationships, I often say that there's two key skills that we need to engage. The first is just asking really good open-ended questions. So often we can make assumptions about where someone's coming from, or we might feel like we're going to disagree and we want to validate our point of view rather than just being still and patient and asking the questions so that we can truly understand the perspectives from the other room. So we can understand the perspectives that the other individual is bringing. So asking those really good open-ended questions and then actively listening. Actively listening is coming back to that embodied communication, which for some of us, we may have started to lose some of those skills, or maybe we never even developed them, where we are making eye contact. We're paying attention to tone and facial expressions. We're paying attention to body language. And we're really trying to listen attentively without being distracted by the asynchronous communication that's dinging on our phone or popping up in our email or in our social media feed. But we're really setting that aside and being present with the person that we're talking with today. There is more than a generation gap today. These moments in history are the ones that we come back to for years and years to come to study and look at to better understand why the world is the way that it is. I often will say that the cement is still wet. All of these changes are occurring right now, and they're occurring with such acceleration that it can be dizzying. Those born into the green room have only known a world where there is constant change and chaos, where we do see everything happening around the world 24/7 in our back pocket. And though it can feel very chaotic and very uncertain, and things are changing so quickly. I was talking with my daughters recently because they were asking what a VCR was. And we were talking about what a VCR tape and a VHS tape and a VCR is. And it just gave me pause how quickly things have changed. That what is the world going to look like in 10 years? We know that things that we're doing today are going to be obsolete in 10 years. So this pace of change can be overwhelming, and yet there's great opportunity in it. We desperately need each other, unlike maybe ever before, where connections were more organic and happened more naturally. Today, we have to practice more intentionality to have these deep, meaningful conversations, connections, and relationships across generations. It does require being uncomfortable. It does require humility because we have to learn from each other. It does require the sacrifice of asking questions and actively listening. But the reward is significant. To be able to connect with those who are navigating the dynamics of a room that looks different than the one that we're comfortable in, and being able to connect and learn from them is so valuable to everything, our mental and emotional health, our careers, our studies, as well as just the success of the things that we look at investing in together for the future in this world that's full of so much rapid change. So I hope that you're encouraged that if you do feel sometimes like people you're talking to are from a different planet, well, they are. They're from a different room sometimes, one that is a completely different color than the one that you're comfortable in. And yet there's great value in connecting with those who come from the other room. So thank you so much for tuning in. This is Jolene Erlacher for The Next Generation. We hope you join us again next time.